Hello, and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am so happy because at long last I get to speak to Tobias Churton. And we had set up an interview ages ago and then had to reschedule. So I'm all the happier to see you. Hello, Tobias.
Hello, Anna. It's lovely to speak to you.
And this is the book that has brought Tobias to me. It is called The First Alchemists. Um, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it and found it to be fascinating because the subject of alchemy is something that, well, I guess a lot of us kind of hear about, but don't have much understanding of what it actually is. And there does seem to be lots of different perceptions of alchemy. So, Tobias, tell us about why it is so tricky to define what alchemy actually is.
It's tricky to define it as it should be defined because there's been a long-standing definition of it, which is completely wrong, and unfortunately has entered the bloodstream of philosophical history. And that is, I mean, if you look it up in probably Encyclopedia Britannica, they will tell you that while it may have to do with the origins of chemistry, that it's about the transformation of base metals into gold. And while this was a misapprehension of many exponents of chemistry after its early years, it's completely false. It isn't. We are talking about metallurgical chemistry, and that's what the word alchemy, which has a lovely romantic cachet, of course, is from the Arabic alchemia, but that's merely an Arabic translation of the Greek chemia, the al being the definite article. So even in Arabic, it means really what we call chemistry, but it's come over it's been Latinized as alchemia, and as alchemy, it's been differentiated from science. And that's the second stage of alchemical history. The first stage of alchemical history, you could say, was when it is differentiated from industry, which is where it belongs. It starts, we're talking about a commercial industry which developed rapidly in the first century AD, first century CE, if you prefer, and developed on in the early years of late antiquity. So during and after the time of Jesus is its greatest efflorescence. So, and the Greek word was chemia or kumia, and the origin of it, as far as I can read all the texts, is to say that it's the art of heat, the art of cooking, the art of roasting. And that's why alchemical recipes are called recipes, because it is associated with the stove, with the cooker. It's about blackness. It's about burning things. It's about applying heat. It's what happens to matter when you apply heat. And the word kum, which is the root of kumia, also in Mesopotamian, also is directly related to the word for black, like the name Ham in Hebrew, the son of Noah, is to say black. So it's the black art merely means that you've applied heat to. So there's the art of heat. What can you do with heat? And the answer is you can transform substances into other things, and that's the art. And the noble and the high and noble art, as Zosimus of Panopolis called it.
So you've brought us right back down to earth and stripped out all of this mystical stuff that's been attached to it, and said, actually, folks, this is about using heat to work with materials, to transform them into something else.
Yeah,
So
it's something useful and commercial. I mean, we're talking about the art of dyeing, and it's about dyes. It's about coloring. It's about coloring materials. Yellowing means to turn it into gold, meaning it looks like gold, and whitening means to turn it into silver, silvery color. And uh, this was mistaken. as my research progressed, you realize the extent of this extraordinary error, that they mistook the notion of dying to the notion of transmutation, as if they had some theory for transmuting one element into another, or one substance profoundly into another. And this is where the confusion would later develop. But it's worth understanding the early years. I think there was a kind of industrial revolution in Upper Egypt from the late 1st century BC, so time of King Herod, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, that sort of period, when you had the development of glass blowing. I think that was a very important technical development that made a lot more possible, because glass, mercury, for example, in glass doesn't corrode or affect the glass, whereas it used to affect the earlier crucibles that were used and vessels. So we're talking about an industrial process which made a lot of money, and it's that confusion of that this process made a lot of money. It's the idea you could turn lower metals into gold. You could, of course, turn lower metals to gold in the same way that you could do up an old car and sell it for more than you paid for it. In that sense, it made gold.
so then who were the first alchemists? What were they actually doing? Because I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking about people who work in forges, for instance, or metallurgy, making jewelry, etc. Um, who were the first alchemists then?
Well, the techniques go back as far as we can tell from the limited evidence that we have. I mean, we should talk a little bit about the limited evidence. I mean, the first papyri, which describe in detail alchemical or chemical, let's call it chemical recipes, um, were the ones we have, the Stockholm papyrus and the Leiden papyrus, were written around 300 AD. But they refer to documents that were originally put down around the 1st century of the Christian era, so at the time of St. Paul, if you like. Now, they describe technical processes to dye fabrics purple, to turn ordinary stones make them look like emeralds or rubies. Diamonds you don't hear much of, but emeralds and rubies, yes, they could do that, or transform things into lapis lazuli, and then to color metals a very credible gold and a very credible and attractive silver. And these are the kind of things. Now, you asked me where this art came from. It appears to have the Egyptian art. It was known as the Egyptian art. Seemed to get a big impulse from Persia, which is no surprise because Persia had invaded that part of the Middle East in the 4th century BC. And there's a character called Ostanes who supposedly have come over from the Persian king and added a great deal to what was known in what was then Greco-Egyptian. I mean, you've got to also remember that the Greeks invaded Egypt in they founded Alexandria in about 331 BC. And from that time, you get a mixture of Greek Egyptian ideas. So that the temples and the priests of Egypt took advantage of new knowledge, but they had actually been producing chemical changes in matter for centuries already. They'd been able to make things that looked like lapis lazuli, which were used in tomb decorations and religious decorations and this sort of thing. And so the impulse seems to come from Persia, but before that, I think they were already working on chemical, metallurgical changes for dyeing purposes in Mesopotamian culture, Akkadian culture, which is before 1000 BC. And the first evidence of this is in the 2nd millennium BC. So around 1500 BC, we're getting some knowledge in Mesopotamia, which is contemporary Iraq. In contemporary Iraq, we're getting some knowledge of working with these substances for dyeing purposes, usually in relation to religious objects, votive objects, holy objects, and if you're wealthy, household objects. I mean, the Old Testament refers to people who had household gods, and rich people would travel around with votive objects which they'd erect in their tents and so forth, and pay obeisance to and so forth. So there's a long link between this industry and religion. And that also later led to some confusion and a great deal of exaggeration.
Okay, so we have the original meaning of alchemy. How then does this become linked with, say, Hermeticism and other philosophies? Could it be that it was simply used as a metaphor originally and then became more than a metaphor for people?
There's no doubt that the chemical process were used as metaphors in late antiquity, by which I mean sort of period Jesus to the end of the Roman Empire. There's no doubt that it was a metaphor of dying, of transformation, of change. But in terms of the link with Hermeticism particularly, well, there are no Hermetic documents that we can absolutely date before the 2nd century AD, CE. And it is important that one of the writers whose the majority of his work survived until the 7th century Byzantine period, when they started collecting in Byzantium, modern Istanbul, they started making big collections of old Greek manuscripts on chemistry, alchemy. The most prolific writer and the most effective writer was Zosimos of Panopolis. Panopolis was in Upper Egypt in the Thebaid area around Thebes, and it was a textile center. Contemporaries called Alchemy, and they're still making textiles in Alchemy. And we are really talking about the industry around textiles and ornamental production. And Zosimos, who's the main subject of the book in many ways, he's the sap in the tree of the book. His name means the survivor, and I wanted really him to survive because he writes the most extraordinarily complex, not complex, difficult complex, but complex in terms of bringing many things together that you just don't expect in a late antique writer, and especially as he was a practical man, not a philosopher as such, but he'd absorbed a lot of philosophy. He's the first person to start relating the work he knows in the forge, in the oven. He's starting to relate that to the things he's read attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. And Hermes Trismegistus, of course, is being venerated by the 2nd century as a sage of all-knowing who preceded the development of Egyptian culture. I mean, he's a creation of Greco-Roman Egyptian culture. He's a universal sage who could speak in the language of the Greeks. He could speak in the language that the Romans understood, and he can speak even to Jews and Christians. These tracts are universal tracts that are meant for a very wide cultural audience. Zosimos has absorbed a lot of this stuff, and he relates the processes of what he's doing to the concept of the cosmos that the Hermetic tracts are promoting. In particular, he's fascinated. There are two streams at least coming into Zosimos. One is the Hermetic tracts, which he venerates. He regards Hermes Trismegistos as a master spirit. The other tract that is very important to him is the Jewish tract of now we call it the Book of Enoch. And that means a lot to him because in the Book of Enoch, the the establishment of chemical science is attributed to fallen angels, what are called the Watchers, who bring this illicit knowledge to earth from heaven. And they shouldn't have, and they're naughty, and they are going to be punished eternally. And in Zosimus's view, and in the view of esoteric Jews and Christians, this is the origin of evil in the world. These Watchers brought this knowledge down in some antediluvian time and corrupted humanity. And that gives Zosimus a bit of a problem, because on the one hand, this knowledge he understands as being illicit in its first appearance on earth. But on the other, of course, it's his salvation, because he said this knowledge came from heaven. It's God-given. And then he has to justify, how can we use this knowledge that came from heaven? We mustn't use it as the Watchers, the wicked angels who fell, used it. We must use it in the spirit in which it was conceived, namely that this is a holy and noble art through which your spiritual development must rise, as you understand that you are dealing with the minutiae of the running of the cosmos. These changes you can see in the chemical vases that are being heated. This is you are observing a divine process that illustrates the mind of God and his tendency to want the spirit to rise. Now, this is why he favors very much a Jewish lady who's gone down in history as Maria the prophetess. She was a first century Jewish industrialist working in Upper Egypt and in Alexandria. And she developed the art of distillation, something every schoolboy and schoolgirl knows in our schools as a fundamental of chemistry. You heat something, it goes up a glass tube, and it evaporates, and so forth. You get a distillation, and you get a changed product at the end of it. This was for Zosimus is a kind of magical. I use that term not too advisedly. It was a spiritual process. It gave an idea of the way God was going to deal with the universe. The higher you get, the closer to a purity you get. And in order to get to that point, you have to dissolve the body. So the body of the metal, under the action of heat, rather like the ascension of Jesus, creates a vapor, and the vapor rises, and that leads to a transformation. That is the fundamental metaphor for spiritual ascension.
So I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about the myth of Prometheus, because it seems that this idea that there is something forbidden that comes down to humanity and leads to disaster goes back further to the myth of Prometheus, who brings the fire of the gods against Zeus's will, and is then punished, and humanity is punished with Pandora's box, etc. So this is an old theme.
Yeah, and we have it today in the mad scientist, and the concern we have about proliferation of nuclear weapons, which, what we have a situation today is the knowledge that should have been kept historically to a minority of dedicated priests of nature, which was the idea of the founders of the Royal Society. They had no notion, they were not interested in the democracy of knowledge at all, which is a modern idea that everyone should know these things. No state on earth wants you and I to know what they're really up to. What we now have a situation where the states of the world buy their knowledge by bribing young scientists to work for them with scant regard for the moral, ethical, spiritual consequences. And that's the problem we have now with North Korea, Vladimir Putin, the Chinese, ourselves and everybody else, is that this knowledge has now gone to a stage where it has turned out to be demonic. And what's fascinating is Zosimus was warning of this possibility, 1700 years ago.
Well, it seems that a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing if it is in the wrong hands. And what makes it the wrong hands is basically the lack of wisdom. So it is not to say that knowledge should be kept to the few. I think that therein lies a recipe for disaster.
Mm.
But
Well, that's what we've got. We've got the paradox that we have.
exactly.
We have allegedly a democratic approach to science, i.e. every child is taught science at school if they so wish to be taught. On the other hand, you have the state operating a reserved area of science which you're not going to know about.
And again, it really does come down to wisdom. Do we have the wisdom to handle the knowledge that is going to produce certain possibilities and effects? And what do we do?
Evidently, we don't.
And evidently, I would agree with you 100%.
From the time they started gassing troops in World War I to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the development of high explosives, it's quite clear that humanity has not reached the level of insight that Zosimus had reached 1700 years ago. And therefore, we must say, what kind of progress does history tell us about? I mean, we have acquired knowledge, but as you rightly say, the question is, have we attained wisdom? And evidently not, I would say.
So we now have I hesitate to use the word, the pure definition of what alchemy is. And I only mean that in the sense that it's the basic roots of what we think of as alchemy. And now we can see the beginning of that process being a metaphor for what now is becoming a kind of philosophical development. How does it become linked with ideas of magic?
Well, it grew up in an era. It's developed an era where magic was in the air all the time. I mean, the philosophy of nature in the first century, time of Jesus, Paul, Herod, was entirely magical. You couldn't move from one end of the earth to another without the belief. You would find it everywhere, universally. The things that happen on earth have spiritual causes, and that demons of some kind, good or bad, or often good and bad, and sometimes good and bad in the same demon, tendencies are there. So it was a magical universe. One of the great things about reading Zosimus is a guy who comes to grips with this, and he writes to a lady called Tobia, who he treats a certain amount of sarcasm at times. But he basically says, look, you're falling for all this magic. You're falling for these priests. He has a particular priest in mind, Egyptian priest called Nilos. And he said, the Virgin Paphnutius, she's giving you all this crap that you have to, you can only do these operations in the furnace at certain times of the day, because that's when that particular decan, that particular demon is in control of the zodiacal time. And he says it's got nothing to do with this. If you become enslaved to demons, they will get the benefit. They will mislead you. And he's, in that sense, he's a kind of prophet of modern science. He's trying to clear the demonic out of the system altogether, even though he understands that the universe is a spiritual system. But he's trying to de-demonize it. He says these demons, and again he's using the Book of Enoch, are around the world at certain places. They inhabit low places. Women are particularly susceptible, he says, to this kind of demonic interest. and you've got to watch yourself and clear your view of that. He said the true tinctures are God-given, and if you obey the rules properly and think about what you're doing, you'll have success. If you start thinking that you can call on some magical power and get the demonic assistance, that you'll have success, he says you won't. And he gives various examples of people who've made fools of themselves through doing that. That's a very remarkable voice to be heard from the 3rd century AD. And he's quite, I mean, Zosimus is really remarkable. Now, the fact of the matter is, obviously, there were many other chemists who were drenched in the magical universe and who were highly, what we would call, superstitious, and who did think that all these, you had to do it at the right time, not for any practical reason, like there's more light in the sky, so you've got a better vision of what you're doing, but because this or that demon was governing the world at that point. He is exploding that. Zosimus is, but we get the feeling that many of the practitioners were already highly magical, that they hadn't made a clear distinction between natural processes and supernatural processes. Now, modern science has condemned all of alchemy as being drenched with supernaturalism and suspect totally. After the 17th century and the development of chemistry, alchemy is tainted with this notion that it was always in hoc, in thrall of demonic powers, and was associated with magic. But the fact is that magical thinking is with us today. It was very much the norm in the first centuries of the late antiquity, and it was very much around in the Middle Ages, and had a big resurgence in the Renaissance, where there was a revival of Greek, Latin works, which suggested that the world's subsisted on spiritual powers, supernatural powers. Isaac Newton, while he was a Protestant Christian, for him the ultimate explanation of gravity was that Christ, the Logos, maintained the universe, and that was the ultimately mysterious source of why the universe worked. So I don't think we'll ever get away from some notion of magic involved with chemical processes. The very idea of inspiration, for example, where did that idea come from? Makes us immediately aware that there's a dimension of mind which is beyond reason, ordinary reason. In other words, you couldn't arrive at that inspiration through simply following a logical process. It had to be that moment, the so-called apple of Newton. So
I think,
yeah,
I think what I find interesting with his perspective is that he's not saying, well, that's not true. What he is saying is, if you just focus on your own relationship with a higher power and the process itself, you don't have to call on things that might be a little bit more dodgy and mislead you. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because really this is also about staying true to intention and not deviating by the temptation of success, allowing yourself to be corrupted.
yes, Zosimus, who's the great teacher in this, is saying that the universe is divine. There is one divine power that operates in our minds and in all things, but it's a unified power, and we do not need to separate the powers into demonic activity, intermediate demonic activity, angelic, etc. He says you must respect the divine system, but don't try and play it like it's how can I say, almost a keyboard, that if you do that you'll get this result. I mean, he gives advice to Tobia, and he says, look, if you want to know God, sit quietly in a room. I mean, it's yoga. He says, sit quietly in a room, still your mind, stop thinking, and God will come to you. And that is the elevated state of mind suitable in which to do your chemistry. So he's certainly not a materialist. He's not saying all these things happen through purely logical causes. He's just saying that all logical causes have a transcendent origin. And if I put that in a nutshell, I'd quote Dean Ing, who said that reason is a gift of the spirit. We are able to make proper rational decisions when we have the greatest spiritual outlook. And that spiritual outlook simply means don't be imprisoned by thoughts alone, and don't trust it's about saying where does this world of thought, where does this gift of creativity come from? Now some people would say, well, you don't need the idea of God for that. You can say it's sort of a natural process. Well, okay, then I'd say the natural process is pretty divine. However you look at it, but then it's, oh, we don't need the poetry. Well, I'm not sure we don't need the poetry. I find I work better when I've got to listen to some music sometimes, and if music be the food of love, play on. And I think if you see the universe as a work of art, or as a poem, or as a piece of music, this enlivens something in us which people who don't have it, you notice the difference. If you've got the light switched on. So you could say he's having his cake and eating it. He's saying, if you're going to engage in this activity, make sure, first of all, the light is switched on. That's really what he's saying. And his view was that there were these this demonic thing which got in the way of that, which gave you a false light, a false hope, the idea you could sort of buy your way cheaply into knowledge, rather than following the natural paths. And he talks about natural tinctures and unnatural tinctures. And natural tinctures are those established from the beginning. In other words, we're talking about the way nature works. So Zosime, it's a pity that, as far as I know, nobody in the Renaissance or in the period of 17th century scientific development, nobody had done the great book on Zosimus. It's such a pity. They just didn't have enough material, because it's taken years for this. It took me years. When I first wanted to write about alchemy, I couldn't get half the text. I remember going to Blackwell's in Oxford trying to get a book on Greek alchemy, and there was nothing. There was a tiny little book, a few pages. I mean, it was pathetic. I couldn't get the material. Consequently, I was deeply misled about what alchemy was. And I was always embarrassed in interviews, and they said, well, what is alchemy? And I knew it was basically a practical process, but my head was also full of this Jungian stuff about, there are a lot of Jungian ideas. There is a spiritual process in which people were projecting their spiritual longings onto something happening in a vase. And this was constellation. You read Psychology and Alchemy by Jung, came out originally in 1943. And you'll get terribly confused. That's why I wrote this book. I wrote this book to say, blow all this away. Let's start at the beginning. This is what they were doing. This is how they did it. This is what they were doing it for. And here you go. And the idea is to clear this air again.
Yeah, because there is a difference between Jungian looking at alchemy in a metaphoric sense.
Too many metaphors,
and the actual.
Very confused. Would you, if you were going to a drive, right? Forget the sat nav. You're going for a drive. What do you want, a map or a metaphor? You want a map, don't you? You want to say, you're going to hit Cirencester. You're not going to hit the image of Venus, or something like this. I mean, you could, of course, write a metaphorical journey, which would make fun reading, but I wouldn't drive by.
No, and Jung is wonderful for many purposes, but all of them psychological.
Yes.
And we are talking about here is looking at it from a much more fact-based historical perspective, of knowing who these people were. So you have done a wonderful job of helping us to get that clear in our minds in this conversation. But best of all, I would highly recommend that if you want to know more, the book that we have been discussing is called The First Alchemists. And here it is. I will be putting a link to it in the description box. Tobias, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, it's been utter delight, Anna, and many thanks for the opportunity. And
Thank you. Now, if people want to find out more about your work, how do they do that?
well, I have a simple, straightforward, even austere website called tobiaschurton.com. And that's one way. But if you put in Tobias Churton onto your Google, you'll find all sorts of stuff from the many years I've been doing my best to clarify these whole Gnostic and related fields.
Thank you once again for your time today.
Thank you, Anna.
And thank you all for watching. Until next time, goodbye.